I was extremely disappointed when I came back and I found that it's been renamed as the Pantai Kahaha Bulan. In other words, Moonlight Beach. I would like to recommend to the government that they restore the original name, because I believe we need more Pantai Cinta Berahi to increase our life expectancy and healthy life. That's by way of introduction. I would like to say that this conference deserves a lot of credit for being forward-looking and being ambitious in doing so. So many conferences these days are agonizing over the recent past or the current period, when in what you're trying to do is looking forward. And in my work over the last 30 years, I've been trying to do precisely that. I will come to that in a few minutes. I want to start by saying that we live in an era of paradoxes. The paradox that most relates to our discussions today is that we have the medical ability to live much longer, yet there is rising morbidity in the world. Many more people are suffering from ill health, including in the richest countries, and many early deaths are taking place. We have a rising need for pensions, but a declining ability to pay for them, or so it seems. We have more food produced in the world today than at any time in history per capita, and yet we have rising food insecurity in many, many countries, including some of the wealthiest in the world. We have higher average incomes than at any time in history, yet rising poverty rates in many, many countries. There was supposed to be a peace dividend at the end of the Cold War, yet here we are in an era of genocides of the most disgusting levels, as we know, and forever wars that never seem to stop. So we have to be careful when we talk about longevity and living to 100, because we're living in a time when many, many, many millions are facing the opposite. We are also living in an era of what I've called rentier capitalism. I've written a book called The Corruption of Capitalism. I wanted to call it rentier capitalism, but my publisher said, no one will understand rentier capitalism. You're talking about corruption. I said, no. In actual fact, people are claiming that they are advancing free market economies, yet in fact we have the most unfree market economy that's ever existed. And more of the income, wealth, and power are going to the owners of property. Physical property, financial property, and intellectual property. And less of the income being generated in any growth scenario I've seen are going to those who perform labor and work. Notice I used the two words labor and work, because in my work I've tried to differentiate between the two. The last paradox I want to mention, and there are others, is that there is more information available than ever in history, yet less knowledge about our cultures, about our history, about our values. Education has been perverted into a human capital process. I'm a professor, and we've just written a book on the education commons, and I was trying to justify writing such a book I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I said, how can I write a preface about this book? And I said, well, I've been a professor at a number of universities and I must have given a lot of talks at universities. And I stopped counting, counting sheep, counting universities, fell asleep. The next morning I woke up and I calculated that after the last 10 years, I've given lectures, invited lectures at 153 universities in 48 countries. That doesn't happen very often, I'm glad to say, but I can tell you that the malaise that I'm about to talk about is global. Whether I go to Sweden, whether I go to the United States, go to Japan, go to China, I find the same phenomena and the same stories and worries. The global decline in the share of income going to those who perform labor and work is actually underestimated, but I'll leave that aside for the moment. Now, rentier capitalism has generated a new global class structure. Class still matters. You don't have to be a Marxist or a Weberian sociologist to know that class matters. We have a plutocracy at the top, a plutocracy of disgustingly affluent people who make more money in a day than 3/4 of the world make in their whole life. Those plutocrats have now taken over the United States. They're moving their money and their power elsewhere. Below them is an elite serving them and a salariat who is having pensions, paid holidays, paid this, paid medical leave, all the trappings, access to the stock markets. More and more of their income is coming from outside the labor market. And below them is a new mass class, the precariat. I wrote the book, The Precariat, the New Dangerous Class, in 2011. It's been translated into 25 languages, including Chinese, unfortunately not Malay, and it's gone into many editions. Every single day, I receive emails from people around the world, including some from Malaysia, including many from Scandinavia, the United States, and all over, China most of all probably, saying, I am a member of the precariat, and the politicians are not taking any notice of us, as if we don't exist. New estimates suggest that possibly a third or more of the adults in many countries are now part of the precariat. Well, what is it? You can define the precariat in 3 dimensions. First of all, they're exposed to a life of unstable, insecure labor. That instability is existentially threatening. But in addition to that, they have to do a lot of work for labor, work for the state, work for reproduction, work for retraining. It's all work, it's not leisure, but none of that is treated as work. But if they don't do it, they pay a heavy price. And this is the first mass class in history, all over the world, whose modal level of education, formal schooling, is above the level that they need to perform the jobs they're likely to obtain. I cannot tell you how many thousands and thousands of people write to tell me that part. They also participate in a treadmill that begins preschool preparation for schooling, and goes on and on and on. Human capital treadmill. You can never be trained enough. Another course, another box of tricks, another paying, another loss of debt, more lifetime learning. For many, it's a fraud, and we should be honest enough. They just learn one box of tricks and it becomes obsolescent, and they have to learn another. In addition, the second dimension is they have volatile, low earnings, and they've lost the non-wage benefits that the salariat and the old proletariat were used to acquiring. No paid leave, no paid medical leave, no prospect of occupational pensions. They have to rely on money wages. And in the process, people in the precariat everywhere are living on average on the level of unsustainable debt. One mistake, one illness, one accident, and they realize they could be the bag lady in the street with all their belongings in a couple of paper bags. Huge numbers of people have those feelings. It affects their health. It affects their longevity. It leads to suicides. In addition, the third dimension is that this is the first mass class in history which is actually in the process of losing the rights of citizenship. Losing les droits acquis, as they say in France. Acquired rights. Losing civil rights, losing social rights, losing economic rights because they can't practice what they're trained to practice. Losing political rights because they do not see in the political spectrum a party or movement representing them. And in the process, the worst feature of being in the precariat is you feel like a supplicant. You have to rely on people for discretionary judgments and charity. As David Hume, the famous philosopher, said, charity is akin to contempt. It's pity. They have to rely on asking favors. Now, of course, the precariat suffers from what I've called in the books 4 A's: anxiety, alienation, anomie, a feeling of hopelessness, and anger. And I said on page 1 of the original edition of the Precariat, which was published in 2011, I said, unless politicians and analysts come to understand the precariat, we will see the emergence of a political monster with a politics of inferno. In 2016, I was invited, very strangely, given my politics, to address the Bilderberg Group. The Bilderberg Group is the elite right-wing movement that's existed since 1954. I thought it was a joke. I initially didn't accept, but then people persuaded me to go. And I was talking about the precariat, and I spent 3 days sitting next to the primary funder of Donald Trump. And in November of that year, I got a deluge of emails from around the world saying, your monster has arrived. And it's gone on since then, because I think the atavistic part of the precariat, the less educated, the people who feel they've lost the past was better than today, these people listen to the populists, they listen to the fascists promising to bring back yesterday. Make America great, make Europe great, make UK great, whatever. They listen to these people. The progressive part of the precariat do not see in the spectrum a party that represents them, and what they have been doing is absconding from the electoral process. People should realize that Donald Trump did not get a majority of the Americans to support him. He got 30%. Anybody who says he got a majority is forgetting that a large number of people are not voting because they do not see the future being offered. That is the context of this conference. Now, we are at a crisis point in the global transformation, the painful construction of a global market economy. Those of you who are social scientists will recognize that this is analogous to Karl Polanyi's great book, The Great Transformation. We've gone through a period when finance has become dominant to the extent of completely dominating economic policy, social policy, privatization, education, healthcare. Private equity is eating up and building huge profits for financiers. And it reminded me of a term used by William Beveridge in his famous report that defined the welfare state of not only Britain, but many other countries, and shaped it even where they had Bismarckian traditions of welfare systems. And Beveridge wrote, "This is a time for revolutions, not for patching." He could say that because he was anything but a revolutionary himself. He was a staid old civil servant who was very unfrightening. But his 5 giants, he said, they have to be slain. The 5 giants were disease, ignorance, idleness, squalor, and want. Well, I would like to suggest that at this critical point in the global transformation, while those 5 giants have not been defeated across the world, we have a situation where there are 8 modern giants that are stopping the building of a beautiful future. The first giant is gross inequalities. Inequalities where we have inequality of wealth being much greater than the inequality of income, and we have inequality in many other respects, including time itself. The inequality of time. I've written a book called The Politics of Time, and it's all about how the inequalities of time determine life's chances and life's health and longevity. If you're in the precariat, you have no control of your time. You have to do what you have to do to survive, to keep going. Whereas if you're in the leisurely classes, you have as much control of your time as you choose. The Elon Musks claim to work 100 hours a week. Maybe they do, but they should work less in my view. But for the precariat, they have no such control. The second giant is insecurity. This is a pandemic in itself. Insecurity erodes the mental bandwidth. It erodes the capacity to be rational, to make decisions about the future. Anybody who's experienced a period of prolonged insecurity knows what I'm talking about. But today we have a very different type of insecurity than the type that Beveridge and before him Bismarck and the Swedish architects of the Swedish model, some of whom were my friends, particularly Rudolf Meidner, they were dealing with a different age. They were dealing with an industrial age. Today, we don't have this old contingency risks for which you can build a social insurance system because you can predict the probability of a shock and predict how to pay for it, etc. We are living in an age of chronic uncertainty. For an economist, uncertainty is different from ordinary risk. It's about unknown unknowns. You cannot predict when you're going to be hit by a shock. You cannot predict who is going to be hit by a shock. And you cannot respond to uncertainty with targeted, selective, means-tested, conditional social security schemes. The targeting errors are huge. I've just been studying a targeted scheme in Thailand, targeted on the poor. We found that over 50% of the beneficiaries were non-poor. They know how to operate the system. A great majority of the poor were not getting any help at all. Renana Jabvala and myself wrote an article in India showing how this is an international phenomenon. If you target, you are slightly fraudulent because it doesn't work as it's on the paper. But we also have more shocks than at any time. We have more hazards. A hazard is something that is predictable but has costs. Anybody who's raised children knows that having a child these days is enormously expensive and involves an incredible number of risks. In my own country, they estimate that to raise one child from childhood to adulthood costs approximately £250,000. That's a lot of money for a lot of people. They can't